What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my thoughts on the concept of early access for video games. Now, generally speaking, I am actually in favor of early access with a few caveats, and we're going to talk about some of that here today. But just to start at the most basic level, if for some reason you're watching this and you don't know what early access is, basically early access is the practice in video game development where they give people early access to their game, albeit at an incomplete state, typically for a reduced price, in order to help the developers do things like improve their game, find bugs, experience the content, of course, and in some cases, just straight up raise money. Now, just from that description alone, you can probably start to see where some cracks might emerge in a practice like that. And I think, to be blunt about it, the success and overall reception of an early access really depends on the individual developer and the game they are trying to make. So I'm going to split this video up into things I think are good about early access and then some negative points that I have to make, and then I'll kind of sum up at the end. So the first and most obvious good thing about early access is that ultimately it provides testing for developers. Either indirectly or intentionally, some of them will allow early access with this intention in mind, simply to help them make the game better. And while I do think that is in and of itself a good thing, it does have some footnotes that you have to take into consideration with that as well. For starters, there is the very valid argument, in my opinion, that at that point what you're essentially providing is a paid beta. And I understand people's feelings about that, frankly. Now, I myself, if the game is at a reduced price for early access, typically don't mind this as much. However, if the developer is charging full price and this is their intention, for instance with Baldur's Gate 3, I am personally less enthused about it. Now, in cases like Baldur's Gate 3, where it's pretty much guaranteed that game's going to launch and receive support, probably going to be fine. However, anything like this is inherently a gamble. Some of the other good things about early access, though, minus those few caveats, is that not only can they address things like bugs, they can balance the game by pulling in data from the early access period about where people are dying, what they need to tune, etc., which is always better for the initial starting experience. And then, of course, there is the simple fact that being an early access can potentially provide a game with more exposure than it might receive on launch day. This is more so true with smaller games than the example of BG3, because at the end of the day, everyone knows about BG3 and it really doesn't need any more exposure. But with smaller titles like, for instance, The Waylanders, which I enjoy quite a bit, they honestly could use that exposure, and early access can help provide that. Now let's talk some of the more negative aspects of early access, and that is, simply put, that sometimes games seem to be in early access almost indefinitely, which definitely seems to be a cop-out for developers in some cases, where they can simply state, oh, well, the game's not finished yet, so we're just taking our time, etc. And I think there does come a point where you have to ask yourself how long is too long, frankly. And while personally I am in favor of games taking as long as they need, I do understand where people are come from when they're buying into early access with the expectation that the game is going to release eventually. Now, I'm a pretty patient person, so it really doesn't bother me to wait for these titles. I think there does come a point where you have to do something a bit more concrete than keep constantly changing things, etc. At some point, you have to be like, okay, we've got to actually move forward. Now, one of the other big negatives you'll see brought up with early access is that oftentimes people will call it a money grab. And I think, again, this varies more so by developer than anything else. For instance, notoriously, actually, you may or may not have heard of this game called Goddess by 22 Cans, which is the studio led by Peter Molyneux, who used to work on the Fable series. Well, Goddess has been in early access for like 5 years or something like that. And you can actually still buy into it right now, which I would highly suggest you do not do, because quite frankly, that game has been abandoned. They took the money and ran. And in cases like that, yeah, that's a pretty obvious money grab. And then probably, in my opinion, the most important negative that tends to happen with early access is that oftentimes the early access content is not the entire game. And that makes sense to some degree. You know, the game isn't finished, obviously. But if you're going to roll out a game in early access with the idea that it be tested and polished on release day, but then only serve up the first part of the game, as someone who reviews and plays games in beta, etc., I can almost guarantee you any part of that game that was not in the beta or the early access period is going to be worse to play. Be that bugs primarily, things like balance issues, difficulty spikes, because those areas of the game simply did not receive the same amount of testing as the early parts of the game did, which leads to a very frustrating part of games for me personally, which is that oftentimes the last half of a game is simply undercooked. Because if you spend time reviewing games, or hell, just playing a lot of them, what you'll eventually notice is that most people do not finish the games they play. That is not some speculation on my part, that is a provable fact. On any given game, less than 40% of the people who play it will actually beat it. In some cases, it's drastically less than that. And developers know this. This is part of the data they take in when they are making games. And as such, the later parts of a game tend to be the worst parts as a result. Not in every case, obviously, but by and large. And I think early access kind of tends to fuel that by allowing the first parts of the game to be very strong and tested, while the later half is just simply not. And depending on the studio, again, some of them will simply fix the major bugs that crop up in the later parts and then move on, which I think then kind of fuels this feeling of being jaded that people tend to arrive at. To give an example of this, a game that I love very much, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, actually. It's a great game. I enjoy it, but the acts that were not included in the beta for that game were substantially worse than the rest of it on launch day. Now, they've done a great and honestly tremendous job of updating it and fixing all that stuff, much more so than most developers, quite frankly. And because of that, I actually do still enjoy Owlcat as a developer. One thing I hope they'll consider doing in the future, however, is including the last acts of their beta tests, but just slapping an NDA on them for the beta test. Now, in an early access period, that's less of a doable thing. Now, in a beta test, that's much easier because it's a more controlled environment. But when you're in early access, that becomes less of an easy thing to do. And I think in an effort to avoid spoilers is why most companies will, in some cases at least, avoid the later half of the game because they don't want to spoil people, but then it leads to this worse experience anyway. And then we arrive at videos like this explaining how early access is a double-edged sword. So to just kind of sum all this up without rambling on forever about it, while generally speaking, I am in favor of early access because I do think in the majority of cases it leads to better games, it is a practice that is nonetheless not without its own problems, and quite frankly, I think it comes down to the individual developer doing the early access on how successful and well received that winds up being. Because ultimately, in these situations, it is up to that development studio to manage expectations, manage their relationship with the community playing their games, and ultimately control the quality of said games. And early access is potentially a useful tool to help them do that. But simply put, early access and its effectiveness simply being a good or bad thing really just depends on the company that is choosing to use that practice and how they choose to use it. But there you go, guys. There are my thoughts on the concept of early access in video games. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.